There is a haunted tunnel in the municipality of Wheeling, West Virginia. The tunnel itself is no stranger to the papers, as a number of murders have sadly taken place there. Last Thursday, at about 6 p.m., 4 men began passing through the tunnel. The sun wouldn't set for a couple more hours, but the inside of the tunnel was darker than any moonless night. It was as if the darkness was hungry and would eat any light that entered it. As the men walked, they began to hear groans and the sounds of different people begging for mercy. This collection of sounds was even more oppressive than you might expect, because of the echo created by the tunnel. These sounds whirled around the men. The men stood there, paralyzed by fear, doing their best to identify where the sounds and potential dangers were coming from. All at once, coming from the solid rock which formed the ceiling above them, and directly over a spot where a man had been murdered, a ghastly form appeared. Now remember, the men had trouble seeing anything in this oppressive darkness. But for some reason, even with the ghost being some distance away from them, they were able to see it clear as day. It was as if he was unaffected by the darkness. The spirit descended, feet first, until it reached a place about halfway from the floor and the ceiling of the tunnel, where it stopped and remained for a few seconds. Although covered with the slime and earth of the grave, the features of the ghastly specter were distinctly visible. It wore the clothing you would expect someone who was getting buried to wear. The face and hands of this ghost were both covered in blood, and it pointed to what looked like a gunshot wound on its head. Without moving its lips, a voice, apparently coming from the throat of the ghost, exclaimed, in a tone so unnatural it's totally undescribable,
"Let the dead rest."
The horror-stricken witnesses of this appalling spectacle rushed from the scene. At the mouth of the tunnel, they ran into another party and immediately shared what they'd just experienced in the tunnel. Because of the sensational nature of the account, the others did not believe and quickly went in themselves. When they reached the place where the apparition appeared before, they began examining the walls, floors, and ceilings. Anything that could explain what the men claimed they saw. This did not last long. The spirit again presented itself as it had previously done, and, with an even more horrifying tone, again said,
"Let the dead rest."
The group was so afraid they barely spoke for days, and appeared to even be afraid of explaining to others what they'd seen in the tunnel. With all of the eyewitness testimonies coming from credible people, the story of the tunnel haunting quickly spread. One man, who has remained anonymous, admitted to also seeing something. He claims he didn't say anything because he didn't want to be thought of as a fool and ridiculed. The man lives within a few miles of the tunnel and was intending to use it to get to a nearby town. It was late in the evening, and he noticed a couple of persons walking about 100 yards ahead of him. He was looking down to guard his steps when he suddenly felt a shiver run down his spine. When he looked up, he saw a man standing a few yards ahead on the track directly in his path. His arms were held up as if he was trying to protect himself during a fight, and his face was bloodied. There was an awful stony glare in his eyes, which rooted the observer to the ground. His first thought was that it was one of the men who had been walking ahead of him. Maybe one of the men assaulted the other. But before he had time to follow out the thought, he glanced past the horrid spectacle and saw the 2 men just about to pass into the tunnel. At that instant, the man, specter, or whatever it was, vanished and was nowhere to be seen. Completely and utterly confused, the frightened man stood gazing at the vacant air, trying to comprehend what he'd seen. In a moment or two, he had recovered sufficiently to think. He looked around carefully. Nothing was out of place. He says he thought at one moment of running forward and telling the men who were ahead, and asking them if they had seen anything. but he reflected that of course the apparition was not there when they passed. The man abandoned his trip right there and quickly returned home.